Colorado, who is the Lamb. They are the Lambkins. And until 1917, they were the Beet Diggers, B-E-E-T. But apparently they were kind of the hub of the sheep and wool industry, and so they changed their names to the Lambkins. And as you can see, it's not a very yeah, I mean, it doesn't provoke fear. What they refer to as the prancing lamb. So I think they had a little bit of problem with that. Probably the newer generation around the 80s was like, you know what, we got to get a little bit better than this. So they came up with a new mascot called Clyde, who actually is a lamb too, but a more fierce-looking lamb. But apparently there was a lot of, I guess, a lot of people liked the old lamb, the prancing lamb, and so they ended up just using Clyde for athletic events, and they were still the prancing lambs or lambkins for the rest of it. So. Yeah, well, I think a ram, I could get along with that. I don't know about a lamb. So anyway, well, let's have a prayer before we get started. We thank you so much for allowing us to be here tonight. And I just thank you so much for each person that's here. And I pray that you'll just bless us tonight as we study this book. Again, as you promised in the first chapter, that when we read and we study this book and we hear this book, that we will be blessed. And I just pray that tonight that you'll open our hearts and our minds as we look at the seals, the visions that you have for us. And more than anything, I just pray that you'll help us to realize that you, God, are on the throne and that you are in control of all things. And I pray that you be with me as I teach tonight. Just give me the wisdom and insight that I need. And I pray that the words that I say will be in accordance with your will and with what you would want me to say. And once again, we thank you so much for Jesus and how much he loves us. In Christ's name we pray, amen. All right, so as mentioned, we're in chapter 6 tonight, which is looking at the seals. And from chapter 6 on, things get a lot more confusing. I say that nobody's one interpretation is perfect. And so, there's all kinds, I've mentioned, I've got all these commentaries, all these things. And so eventually when you teach a class, I can't just teach every single perspective. So I've kind of got to settle on what I believe is the way it should be, and give that information to you. So just to sort of qualify, some of these things that we're going to talk about. But I don't think, as I mentioned from the very beginning, we don't need to get bogged down sometime in the details of the things that we don't understand and miss the main point of Revelation. And even tonight, what the opening of these seals actually mean, I think is really less important, is less about what's going to happen and really more about who is acting, meaning that God is in control. We talked about that last week, right? God is on his throne and he's in control and ruling over creation. That's probably the main point that I think we need to get. And the second thing is that the existence of suffering and violence in the world doesn't nullify the sovereignty of God over his creation. And so that's probably the second most important point. And then the third thing is that faith in Jesus is worth it. So we are safe with Jesus. And that's really the point that I think Jesus was trying to get a church, in the things that they were going to, that, hey, I'm here, I'm in control, and you're safe with me. So beginning in chapter 6, tonight we're going to take a look at these series of judgments. And beginning tonight, we're going to look at the 7 seals, and then that's going to 7 trumpet judgments, and then the 7 bowl judgments we'll get to as well. And so tonight in chapter 6, it's the first 6 seals that we're going to look at. And then next week, when we get to chapter 7, there's actually like an interlude, like this break in the action between the opening of between the opening of the 6th seal and the 7th seal. And then chapter 8, we'll get to the 7th seal, and that will actually go right into the trumpet judgments as well. And so I think one question that whenever you interpret Revelation that you've got to answer is, are you going to interpret Revelation or read Revelation cyclically or chronologically? And the reason why I say it is because a lot of people, especially when you get to the 7 seals, become fascinated with these and begin to try to interpret these seals as a series of events that occurs chronologically. So in other words, one seal, then the next seal, then the next seal, and then on and on. And really what they try to do is they try to match events or visions with events that occur, in the newspaper, or which I guess we don't wear newspapers anymore, but in the internet or wherever you get your news. They try to match those visions to those until ultimately you get to the end of the world. And so according to this approach, when you're going to arrive at the first seal whenever there's some major conquering power that develops, and then that goes into all this violence that erupts and so on and so forth until you get to the end of the world. And really, I don't believe that prediction is the right word for these visions that we're gonna look at. Apocalyptic writers use a form of, or a style of writing called recapitulation. And I know I mentioned to y'all Rick Ashley's podcast or his sermon series. I know Kevin's listened to it, and it is fantastic. And I wish I could do as good a job as he does in kind of different angle or a different point of view. So just to kind of give you some examples of recapitulation, instant replay. That's an example of recapitulation, right? You see a play happen, and then you get a replay of it from a bunch of different angles. It's not the different play. You're still seeing the same thing. Some examples in the Bible would be like in Genesis chapter 1, where we get a story of the 7 days of creation. And then you get to chapter 2, and it basically retells the 6th day of creation from the viewpoint of Adam and Eve, or the creation of man and woman. In Daniel chapter 2, if you remember, Nebuchadnezzar had that dream about the world powers, the 4 world powers, and in his dream, his dream used metals to describe each of those world powers. Well, then you get to Daniel chapter 7, and Daniel has a similar type of dream about those same world powers, but in his dream, it uses those powers. So a different way to tell the same story. I think the Gospels are a good example of recapitulation, right? It's the same story about Jesus, but it's told from a different perspective, sometimes even in a different order. Because if you read Revelation sequentially and believe that this event has to follow this event and so on and so forth until the end of the world, you develop some problems when you interpret that way. For example, we're going to get to the bowl judgments later on, and when we get to the 3rd bowl judgment, we're going to see that all the rivers turn to blood in the 3rd bowl judgment. But then when we get to the 6th bowl judgment, it says that the water in the Euphrates River dries up, and so that creates some confusion. So if the rivers were all turned to blood, how did they later if they were all blood? So you can't the book of Revelation in that way, sequentially. I mean, you can, and a lot of people do, but I think it's misinterpreting the way we're supposed to be reading it. So as I mentioned, there's going to be 3 judgments. There's going to be the seal judgments, the trumpet judgments, and the bowls, and each of them are going to give us a different perspective about God's judgment. And we're going to see when we get to the trumpets and the bowls that those judgments sound a lot like the plagues in Egypt. If you think back to the plagues of Egypt in the book of Exodus, who were those plagues designed to affect? Right? It was the Egyptians. So it was a plague on the Egyptians and not the Israelites. And the trumpets and the bowls are going to show us from the perspective of the unbeliever, specifically Rome, in this case, what God is going to do to judge the world. Whereas the seals give us this perspective more from the believer and what the believer encounters, and how God's judgment affects the church. So if we read Revelation cyclically and not chronologically, it basically means that we're in the last days now. So in other words, chapter 6 that we're going to look at tonight tells us just as much about the last days as chapter 16 does. Rick actually said this. He says, I believe the last days were inaugurated by the coming of Jesus and will be consummated by the second coming of Jesus. And I think he's right about this, and I think there's some New Testament that back this up. If you remember in Hebrews 1:2, it says, in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways, but in the last days, in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Spirit. And you remember on the day of Pentecost when Peter got up and he says, in the last days, God says, I will pour out my Spirit on all people. So this verse was again, Peter speaking to the crowds on the day of Pentecost, and he was referring back to something that the prophet Joel had said regarding the last days, which Peter says is happening now on the day of Pentecost. The last days were taking place. And again, to quote Rick Ashley, he says, the coming of Jesus and the ushering in of the age of the Holy Spirit is God's final move before eternity. In other words, nothing has to happen that hasn't happened yet before Jesus can come back. And I think that's important because, again, we talked to you in the beginning about the futurist approach and the premillennialists or the dispensationalists and how they look at Revelation as this book that's going to happen in the future, and that all these judgments are future events that predict the end of the world. And I just don't think that's how Revelation was intended, or how Jesus meant for us to read the book. So back to chapter 6. It begins with a series of visions that describes the contents of the scroll as they relate to the 7 churches and the crisis that they're about to experience. And so what we're going to see here, these seals, remember there's 7 of them, the seals are broken, and it allows the contents of the scroll to be opened. And so I would say the first 4 seals are probably the most famous. A lot of people who know about the book of Revelation, right? Everybody knows about or have heard about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, right? When people, if you had asked even a layperson who's never read Revelation or maybe not even believe in God, they probably know, if you mention the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, they probably have heard of that before. And we're going to talk about these individually, but I think they represent war and conquest, violence and bloodshed. The book of Zechariah and the vision that Zechariah had in chapter 1 and chapter 8. And you may not be familiar with the visions he had, so I'm just going to guys them a little bit. So in Zechariah's vision, there were actually 4 colored horses that he describes. They were red, black, white, and gray. And at times, like in chapter 1, these horses had riders on them. And then when we get to chapter 6 in his vision, I think I said chapter 8 earlier, but chapter 6, they actually pull chariots. And so these horses in Zechariah, they actually don't ride out and inflict any kind of judgment on the earth, but instead they go out and patrol the earth as representatives of God. And I think that's important to know that. So those horses were patrolling the earth. Well, in John's vision, these horses that we're going to read about don't just patrol the earth, but they bring against the earth, and including the familiar threats of war and famine and death. And I think there's a reason why these 2 visions are connected. And I think the connection between these horses in Zechariah's vision and the horses in John's vision is that it means that God is active in these human experiences, these experiences of war and famine and death, that he's active in them to be able to accomplish his purposes and plans. And I'm going to expound on that a little bit more. So we also need to understand that these horses are symbolic, right? I mean, the whole book of Revelation is symbolic. And so we need to realize that this text is not, we're not to expect, this solitary rider on a white horse and with a bow and a crown to come riding past us one day. These are symbolic, things that we're talking about. And so this vision really stands for a larger reality. So with that kind of background, let me just go ahead and read. I'm just going to read the first part of chapter 6 about the first 4 seals, and then we'll pause and talk about those, and then we'll read the rest of them later. Man, it is hot in here, huh? Y'all hot? Golly, I don't know if I'm just nervous or what, but Man. All right, so let's get into it. So it says, I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. And when the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." And then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. And to him was given a large sword. And when the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was a pair of scales in his hand. And then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine. And when the Lamb opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come." All right, so we see here that when this first, I'm sorry, I lost my point. So the opening of the 4 seals we see here follows a set pattern, right? So each seal is opened by the Lamb, who is Jesus, and then the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, a commanding voice, right? They say, "Come," and a horse and rider appear. Ian Fair, who I love, he has such a good commentary. I mean, Jan actually turned me on last week to this. So he has a sermon series as well. Not a sermon, it's a class series he does. And he has this South African accent. And when he reads this and he says, "Come," and it's like, it is so awesome. I thought about getting Jim McConnell to come in here and read it just so y'all could see. But anyway, he says that he thinks even a better use of this word, "come," or better translation might be "go." So, and if there's an exclamation point behind this verb "come," and so it's really powerful, right? It's saying "come," meaning that there's divine authority here, or divine permission that's being granted by God. And it's a sign of God and Jesus having absolute sovereignty over all creation. They are in complete control over each of these horses and each of these riders. And I think one thing that we can gain from this is that Christ's reign extends over every situation that the church in Asia is going to shortly be facing, including societal opposition, persecution, suffering, and even death, which is what these horses here are representing. Rick Ashley said this: the best way to understand the first 4 seals is that they show what the church would have to face from Rome before Rome would begin to feel God's judgment. So the 4 horsemen represent the world as it is in rebellion to God's authority and moral order. Or said another way, it's the kind of world that we create when we live apart from God. So God's the absolute ruler of the world, right? I think we'd all agree on that. But He's given human beings the power of free will. And so when they abuse this gift, like we do all the time, then suffering and disaster will result, which is, again, what these horses are representing. So God created us to live in harmony with Him and to live in harmony with each other. But what these 4 seals are saying is that war and strife have become the human condition as a result of excluding God. So the woes of these 4 horsemen are a result of not taking God seriously. So let's look at them individually. So the first horse, right, is when it's open, a white horse bearing a powerful, victorious conqueror comes forward, and he has a bow, right? It says he has a bow, and it says he was given a crown. The interpretation of this horse is that it signifies the threat of war, human wars, and conquest. And I think this is an appropriate interpretation. One reason is just if you looked at what victorious military leaders did back in that day, from the Persians to Julius Caesar, when they were victorious, what you would often see is they would ride in on a white horse, which is what I think this is signifying, is war and conquest. And the fact that this rider has a bow like a bow and arrow, brings into another thought about conquest, and maybe that thought is conquest by an outside power. And the reason why that is thought of is because during this time, the Roman army had really not started to adapt the use of an archery or a bowman in their military, but a lot of other ones did, including the Parthians, who were to the east of Asia, and they were a constant threat to Rome, and there'd been all kinds of skirmishes with the Parthians, and so there's the thought that actually what this is in could be conquered by an outside power. And so Craig Kester, said in his book, said the vision of the mounted bowman does not so much express Roman fears as it challenges the presumptions of Roman strength. So in other words, for those people who are putting their trust in Rome, they need to realize that they were vulnerable, that Rome, more important to that interpretation, is that in chapter 19 of Revelation, we're actually going to see Christ is riding on a white horse. And so, and I think there's good reason to believe that. And I'll tell you why I don't think that that's the case. I don't think that Christ would be answering to a living creature saying, go or come, saying it's time for you to come out. I don't think that, to me, that doesn't go along with Christ being the rider here. The second thing is that, is that this rider's waging, that Christ wages war with a sword of his mouth. He doesn't need a weapon. And I think probably the most important thing is it really doesn't fit with the theme of the other horses. Christ be on this horse, and then the other ones kind of be these sort of, bad characters, so to speak. It still works, I think, if in a lot of people that I respect, say that it is Christ. All right, let's go on to any questions about that before we move on? All right, let's go on to the second seal. So the opening of the second seal reveals this fiery red horse with a rider who's given a large sword and causes men to slay one another. So he's given power to take peace from the earth. And this would have reminded the saints or the Christians in Asia that they would never be without some form of political unrest. They've been living in constant turmoil really pretty much all their lives. And so I think this vision signifies bloodshed, Rome's persecution of the church. The second horse reveals the world in chaos, violence and chaos. And so I think the vision is written in a way that really directly disputes one of Rome's prevailing attitudes. In fact, Rome took the position that you should be grateful to them because they were keeping the peace. In fact, they had a saying, there was Pax Romana, which meant Roman peace. But even though Rome professed this peace, there was really turmoil and rebellion all around in Rome. Rome was always in a state of